Welcome to part 3 of this Carpology series. Hope you enjoyed the last one on watercraft. Had a lot of great feedback about that, so thanks for getting involved, guys, much appreciated. So for this piece we're going to be looking at rigs predominantly, but also the other things that go with them, lines, leaders. I'll show you my rod setups as well. Going to be talking about my maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 favourite rigs that I tend to use most of all. And I'm not going to make it overcomplicated with loads of rigs because there's too many rigs out there, and I know it causes a lot of people confusion. So we'll be looking at the key things that make a rig successful, the key things to look for in a rig, and also when to use those rigs, over what sort of bottom. Should you be thinking about camouflage? Should you be worried about whether it's silt or gravel, etc, etc. So there's a lot going on there. I'm going to try and break it down into digestible bits and pieces for you. As I said, there's an overriding factor of confusion out there with a lot of anglers. You know, there's all of this information by media, whether it's printed media or via YouTube and various other outlets, and a lot of people are fishing a lot of different styles. And certainly if you're new to the sport, and in a lot of cases, even if you're not new to the sport, I see it all the time, people can get very, very bogged down in what is the right approach and what is the right rig. There is no right rig, but people can get really, really transfixed on the minutiae of different details and not look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is, are you in the right spot? Are you in a swim with carp in it, as we looked at in the last feature? Once you're in that situation, you need to present a rig on clean bottom, untangled, with a sharp hook and a good quality bait the fish is willing to open its mouth for, because if it isn't going to open its mouth, you are not going to catch it no matter what. So they're the key fundamentals, and I know a lot of different anglers have their favourite go-to rigs. So when people watch a blog or read something in a magazine, they might take away from it, oh, he catches loads, that's his rig, I'm going to try that. And a lot of people end up changing basic approach and rigs almost weekly. You know, they'll go fishing, don't catch anything, oh, that's not the one, that rig. Or maybe they'll blame the bait and think, well, you know, I should just change to something else. And usually the accountability, the reasons for those failures lie a bit closer to home than blaming a rig or a bait. Yes, occasionally they do play, well, they always play an important role, and occasionally they can be the difference between that fine line of success and failure, but more often or not, it's more overriding factors, simply location and where you're presenting yourself. So, as I said, I'm going to try and break it down, disseminate it into different sections so it's digestible, so that you can understand it easily, and importantly, so that we don't cloud the issue and make what is a confusing area even more discombobulating. So let's get into it. We're going to probably have a start with our rod and line setups next. What is your single most important piece of all your fishing tackle? A lot of people come up with a lot of different answers to that question, and to my mind there is only one answer. There is nothing more important than the line you are fishing with. And paradoxically, I would say it is also the most universally disregarded and taken advantage or taken granted of piece of all of our fishing tackle. And when you think that it's well less than 0.5 millimetre of extruded plastic that we put all of our faith in to land the fish of our dreams, hopefully, it's a wonder really that more people aren't obsessively compulsive about checking their line and making sure that it is in pin sharp, perfect, immaculate condition at all times. The line goes through a lot. It's out there in that underwater environment, even when it's not in that underwater environment, when we're transporting our rods and reels, when we're going through bushes, when maybe if it's in storage, you know, some people put their rods and reels next to a radiator when they're at home, or UV degrades, natural sunlight will degrade your fishing line, you know. So lines take a lot of wear and tear, and a lot of people seem to have the modus operandi, if you like, that all they're going to do to negate any degrading of their line is they're simply going to replace it every year, maybe every couple of years. And that isn't enough, because if you're just replacing it, then you are ignoring the fact that there is a very real possibility that there is damaged line on the reel that you are actually fishing with. And that is unacceptable. Damaged fishing line leads to lost fish. Now, some of you might have thought the most important part of your fishing tackle, I was going to say, was maybe your hook. Yes, hooks are important, hooks are vital, but the line is even more so, because if a hook partially fails, i.e. begins to open out a little bit, you can still land a fish on it. But if your line partially snaps, you're screwed. It's game over. All you need to catch a fish is a hook and a line. So they are your two cornerstones, your most fundamental aspects. We will have a look at hooks separately, because I've got a real passion for those. But the line, let's just get back to the line. You really have got to get in the habit, if you're not already, of checking your line every minute that you're fishing. And this starts off for me by soaking my line. As soon as I arrive at the lake, handfuls of water onto the reel. Monofilaments are hygroscopic, which means they absorb water, so they get softer as they're exposed to water. You probably all noticed how in a real wet weather fishing session, your line is just like silk, and that's because it's absorbed water. And conversely, when you're fishing in these sort of conditions, when it's really bright and there's no humidity and it's very warm, then the moisture will get sucked out of everything and your line can almost become quite brittle and crinkly feeling. So keep your lines wet. I even keep my spools wet during the course of the fishing session, pour in a little saucepan of water on the spools, particularly if you're going fishing in France where it's 40 degrees and you're out there for a week. In those situations, I will quite often lay a hand towel across the top of all of my spools. That's how obsessive about my line I am, because, as I said, your line is everything. And a great man once said to me when I was starting out, never ever compromise on the thickness of your line. Fish as thick and as strong a line as you possibly can. That advice has unquestionably caught me extra fish year on year to this day. And when I see people compromising their diameter and using thin lines, it's an accident waiting to happen. Yes, occasionally you need it for distance, but those situations or those lakes are quite rarefied. I fish around a lot of different places all over the country, and very, very rarely over the course of a year do in fact, I cannot remember the last time I had to fish at 100 yards. 80 yards is a long way for me, and although I can do it if I need to, it's quite rare. In fact, on the lake I'm at now, most of the fishing is done to the middle at 100 plus yards, and yet all of the fish I've caught this year have come at, I think the longest I've caught one has been 40 yards, you know. So there are always opportunities. What I'm saying is that don't think you need thin line to cast a long way, because most of the time you don't, and sooner or later that will come back to bite you. Now, if you've got a line which is on the thin side, and we have to start thinking about diameters, not breaking strain. Breaking strains are they're just a number that the manufacturer can put on a spool to say what they say it breaks at. They're hugely variable. The diameter is usually much closer to the truth. Match anglers have been talking in terms of diameter for tens of decades now, and as carp anglers really need to get their head around thinking about diameters as well. So my rule of thumb is, if I'm fishing for big fish in testing environments, i.e. if there's any weed or snags, then the line for April to November, certainly, maybe all year, has got to be 0.4 millimeters. That's proper, thick, strong rope. And that means that if you get any abrasion, any surface damage, any nicks or anything in that 0.4, you're still left with plenty to land the fish. Whereas if you get nicks, abrasion, any kinds of surface damage in a line that starts off at 0.3, then as soon as you've damaged that even by a third, you're down onto what is effectively a match fishing line. And you try and land a big carp on it and it breaks. And you, down the years, you know, I've heard a lot of, you know, oh, I was playing a fish in the middle of the night and that line just snapped like cotton. You know, you hear it, and lines don't just snap. Something causes them to snap. And I've heard anglers speak disparagingly about different manufacturers. Oh, that shit Nash line just snapped in the middle of the night, or that rubbish Korda line, you know. It's very, very rarely, in fact, virtually never in my experience, is it the fault of the line. It's down to the fact the line's got damaged and the angler hasn't noticed and removed it. And then they've just blamed the line for breaking. It's a bit like never putting oil in your car and blaming your car for breaking down. It's just brainless. So lines need to be maintained. They need to be absolutely respected and looked after and treated well. So as I said, the first thing I do when I get to the lake is I wet the spool so that the line is soaking up that water while I'm setting up, and will be nice and manageable for me to cast with and use during the session. And periodically throughout the session I'll keep that nice and wet. Just come into my mind, I was thinking about diameters. So the lower end of diameters that I would use for carp fishing, and this is if I had to do some distance fishing, or if it was winter, or if I'm fishing a lake there's no weed or snags and things like that, then I would maybe go down to 0.35. 3.5, 3.7, that's a good sort of line. 0.37, 0.35, it's a few steps away from the 0.4. It will get you out further, but only ever do that if there are no obstacles and there's nothing that can cause you any bother. I would never, in any carp fishing situation, go below 0.35 millimeters for anything. And as I said, generally I'm up at 0.4, fish thick, proper, strong rope. You won't lose any tackle. It sinks better, it just performs, and it catches me a couple of extra fish every year where I've landed it and it's been shaved up or chafed on something. I think, you know, if I'd had a thinner line on, that would have been game over. Now, you need to get into the habit of checking your line regularly through your fingers. If there is anything on your line that leads you to think it is substandard in any way, then strip it back, cut it off, get rid of it. If you tie a knot to anything, to a swivel or to the end of a leader, and the line is crinkly behind where you've bedded the knot down, cut it away and do it again and bed it down more gently with lots of lubrication, a bit at a time. If anything is suspect on your line, you have to get rid of it. After you fished a session, I check it. During the session I check it. When we're wrapping out, it's a great opportunity to run the line through your fingers, feeling and checking for anything that might be amiss. If you find anything that is different from a super silk, smooth diameter like I have on this Berkeley line here, then cut it out and get rid of it. There is no room for doubt, damage or weakness on your fishing line. It is your first, second and third line of defence and attack, and it must be perfect at all times. Yeah, I'm going on about it a bit. You can see I'm quite obsessed with my line, so it's got to be bang on. So keep checking it. Now, when do you change your line? For me, my line only gets replaced when it gets so low on the spool that it's starting to affect and compromise my casting potential. Now that means that there is never at any time any bad line on the reel, because I'm cutting it back and getting rid of it. The line on my reel, whether it's 1 year old or 1 month old or 2 years old, the line on my reel is perfect. It just might get lower, or it will get lower and lower as I cut it back. And once you get down lower on the spool, that's the time to change your line. You should never be changing your line because it's damaged. There should never be any damaged line on your reel. Good rule of thumb, I guess, is probably changing your line once a year, dispose of it responsibly, cut the hanks up into small pieces and recycle using the line recyclers if you can. So the lines that I've been using this year are, and actually a lot of years, going back to late 90s, Berkeley fishing lines, world renowned, come out of the States. Berkeley make fishing lines and have done since dot. They are the line experts. A lot of companies supply line and source it from elsewhere. Very few lines are actual experts in line manufacturing, but Berkeley are and have been for a very, very long time now. As you'll see from both of these lines that I've been using, very, very high diameter, 0.4 in each case. This is the top end, 𝗵𝗵𝗿𝗍, which is has got reduced stretch and fast sink rate, very, very high quality line. And then the one that my reel is loaded with at the moment is the 𝗵𝗵𝗍𝗍, which is a really good all-round carp fishing line, very user friendly. So whatever you choose, ignore the breaking strain, look at the diameter, and 0.4 is what you need for most carp fishing situations. Both of these lines cast very, very well. They sink well, they knot well. Sign of a good line, you tie a 5-turn grinner knot to a swivel or something and it doesn't go all crinkly behind and you don't have to do several goes to get it right. It's very knot friendly. Both of these lines are very knot friendly and very durable as well. So what I have also been looking at is something new. Now this is FluoroShield, and this is a blend of fluorocarbon and copolymer. It's a new project from Berkeley, and I've just got hold of some and I'm going to be testing this and giving it a go. But this is, let's have a look, this is 0.38, nice and thick. As you can see, for something that is part fluorocarbon, incredibly soft and supple. I haven't even stretched that, straight off the spool. So that's the FluoroShield. I will be using that a bit this winter. I do like a fluorocarbon, so I'll be getting to grips with that and I'll let you guys know how it performs. Fluorocarbon is something that I've used a lot over the last, well, decade or two really, because not because I like its invisibility, because I think that's a bit of a moot point. Certainly in a lot of water conditions, fluorocarbon can be worse for visibility than normal lines because they do tend to attract any suspended particulate in the water column. And if you've used fluorocarbon a lot yourself, you would have seen you get up in the morning, you go and have a look at your rods, and the line's like a laser beam going out through the water, where it's all of this different particles and algae and so on have attached themselves to it. It's almost like iron fillings to a magnet sometimes. So the first thing I do, you know, line management again, when you're using fluorocarbon, unclip the bobbins, pay off a bit of slack, turn the alarm off and give it a good shake from the rod end, and you'll see all of the little bits puff away and you'll be back to as near as an invisible line once again. But the invisibility isn't the main reason I use fluorocarbon. I use fluorocarbon because it is damn robust and it's very, very, very durable, much more durable than normal monofilament in every case. Some people down the years have told me they've done abrasion tests and found that fluorocarbon has been nowhere near as good as mono. And whenever you talk to them, it's always the case that they've tested it in a dry environment. And if you test lines on an abrasion test in a dry environment, you will find that fluorocarbon comes a long way behind normal mono. The reason for that is that fluorocarbons do not like heat or friction and will not perform well at all. But to me, it's kind of a bit sort of pointless because there is nothing that's going to abrade our lines in the dry. It's going to happen out there in the wet. And when you do a wet test, like for like, fluorocarbon far outperforms normal copolymer monofilaments. So I like them for that, the durability. Even if you try and bite through fluorocarbon, it is very, very tough. And of course, it sinks brilliantly, which is something I really do like. A final factor is that fluorocarbons generally have maybe 5% less stretch than a normal mono. So you get that great contact on the drop with the lead. So, you know, as I said, a lot of my fishing is short to medium range. So fluorocarbon suits me a lot. Haven't used this one yet, but I'm going to be giving it a go. So that's the lines. Again, check your lines all the time. Don't compromise. If you're fishing small waters and the fish are very aware of what's going on, then fluorocarbon is a very, very good bet. And if you're fishing a more varied situation, then something like the 𝗵𝗵𝗍𝗍 or 𝗵𝗵𝗍𝗍 standard copolymers will serve you well. So just coming down to this setup that I've got here, this is my standard sort of go-to setup that I can use on any lake in the country. Some places have different rules and you'll never be in breach of a lake's rules if you turn up with tubing and a lead clip. You know, it's the universal, totally safe setup that you can use anywhere. So I've got a new Pen Rival reel here fitted to my Gray's air curve, 3.25 pound, which is again probably the ultimate all-round test curve for a carp fishing rod. It'll get you out to 120 or more if you need to, but is equally good for fishing in close as well. So the line on the reel is the CM70 that I showed you earlier in 0.4, which is rated at 18 pound by Berkeley, but nice and thick 0.4. Now my tubing setup here is very, very simple. Lead clip, tail rubber and tubing. So on there I've got a lead, which is, I get my leads from West Country Leads. This is a Roger and Kerry style, which I do prefer. I use this style for all of my fishing. If I was going out a long way, then I would go bigger and with a more streamlined, tapered style, maybe tournament distance style lead. But again, it's quite rare. I carry them in a van as spares, but this dumpy Roger and Kerry style I absolutely love. Now, on this tubing, you'll see that the tubing is, in inverted commas, camouflage. So all I do with my end tackle is I fleck it up with a marker pen. I'm not worried about matching the lake bed. So when it comes to camouflage, all I want is my line to be sunk and out the way, and for my end tackle to look as natural as possible. Now, if I drop this in the margin, although you might be able to see it on certain types of bottom, it certainly wouldn't raise an eyebrow or a pectoral fin, because it looks entirely natural. Now, camouflage is not just about matching a background or a particular substrate, it's about breaking up an outline. And that's what I've done with this tubing. It's flecked, and the lead clip, the rubber, everything is flecked so that when it's in situ, it looks entirely natural. So again, if I'm fishing on gravel, silt, clay, sand, mud, doesn't matter. Just make it look natural and get on with it. Don't worry about buying this whole litany of different types of stuff to match the bottom, which manufacturers are trying to sell you. It's pretty pointless, and it will only cost you money. I use this everywhere and it works really, really well. So the length of tubing should always be longer than hook link, in case you didn't know. That's what stops your tangles. And on the end of the tubing, I've got a blob of Thinking Anglers putty just to make sure it stays nailed down. Now, if leaders are allowed on your lake, then I do like to incorporate some fluorocarbon. And what I do is I make a leader of 20 pound fluorocarbon, and this is big game fluorocarbon, very, very tough and durable. And what I like to do is have the last few feet, 6 feet typically, consisting of this fluorocarbon. It threads through the tubing beautifully, and then I tie it to the main line with a double grinner knot, back-to-back grinner knot, and then I put putty around that knot. So I've got 6 foot of leader, and you can see there the joining knot covered in putty. So it means that my end tackle is going to be laid completely flat on the bottom and is going to be very difficult to see. And because fluorocarbon is so tough and durable, the last 6 foot of my line is very, very capable of dealing with gravel bars, mussels, branches, anything that's out there, which will always find us at some point. If I need a casting leader, just to clarify, casting leaders, a lot of people seem to think that if you've got a leader, it only needs to be a few feet on the end of the line and they can put a big lead on it and cast it out. That's not a shock leader or a casting leader. The only way a shock or casting leader can work correctly is if it comes all the way through the rod and has at least 3 turns onto the reel. Very, very important. So if you're using a leader because you need to augment the casting strength of your line, you're using a big lead or a solid bag, or you're just fishing a long way out, then the leader must come from the lead all the way to the reel, and then at least 3 turns on the reel. Don't want too many either. Between 3 and 6 turns is bang on. So very rarely, again, as I said, do I need a shock or casting leader, same thing. But if I do, I use this stuff and I'll bring it through 3 to 4 turns on the reel, no more than 6, and that is the job done. As I said, most of my fishing is short to medium range, and a 6 foot length of fluorocarbon, nice and thick on the end with a bit of putty, is all I'm going to need. So before we get on to looking at rigs in detail, let's talk about hooks, and in particular hook sharpening, which is a real huge obsession of mine, where in fact the whole field of hooks is my favourite part of fishing tackle to think about and work with, and I have got an obsession with hooks like I have with line. And the first hooks that I was involved in designing were back in 1997, 98. So, and I've done them for a few companies now, so I've got a bit of an idea on what, in my opinion, makes a good hook and why those features make it good. And I'm also obviously very fussy about the sort of hooks that I use, which might surprise you a bit. I've got some quite old-fashioned choices. So for my pop-up or bottom bait fishing, size 4 Continentals usually for the pop-up, and the old-fashioned T6 Raptor. I mean, both of these hooks are as old as the Ark. I'm nearly out of these now, so I've been making a bit of a changeover, a bit of a switch up to the new Thinking Anglers hooks, which are performing really, really well. So the key attributes with all of those hooks, the thing that they have in common is that they all have a beaked point, which means an inwardly curving point. Not to be confused with a curved shank. It's a point that is shaped like a talon, like an eagle's claw. I know there is a bit of conjecture out there whether between straight pointed hooks and beak points, and some anglers say, well, a straight point catches more easily. Well, one thing I am sure of is that a beak point lands more fish. You look at anything in nature that's designed to grip flesh and not let it go, it's curved, like an eagle's claw or whatever it is. And I'm convinced that over the course of a given year, I land 1 or 2 or 3 extra fish, whatever it may be, because my hook holds are very, very secure. Do I think it's costing me anything in missed bites? Not at all. I sharpen my hooks so obsessively that I think that they're an edge in themselves, the hook points, and if they very slightly curve inwards, I really don't think I'm missing anything. But I think the key is the hook to landed ratio. You know, we want to be landing as many fish as we can, and there is no doubt in my mind that a beaked point allows you to do that, especially when coupled with a wide gape, a short shank, and if you can, an offset as well. Now the old-fashioned hooks have an offset to the point, which means that if that's the shank, the point is not parallel like it is on modern hooks, it's offset like that. Now that offset coupled with a beak is, if you look at it, the shape of it, it's like the beginning of a corkscrew spiral. And what it does is it just twists and beds in, it doesn't tear or rip, it just stays in position. And there's no doubt again in my mind that a beak point combined with an offset and a short shank wide gape, you can't really improve on that sort of general shape for reliability, which is what we all want from a hook. Now, there is a train of thought out there in the angling world that says, why do we need to sharpen our hooks? We've been catching them on hooks out the packet for the last 50 years. What's the point? What's the point? What's the need? What's the game? And I think that mindset, that way of thinking is very limited. It's almost like we've been using cane rods for the last 50 years. Well, what do we need glass fibre for? Or we've been using glass, what do we need carbon for? Things move on, things progress. And I think a lot of it is from anglers who are maybe for one reason or another afraid to upset their sponsors by saying that they hand sharpen their hooks. But it's not a slur on any company, because it is not possible to mass produce hooks to the level that I'll show you shortly. It just isn't. They would all be damaged, and they damage each other during the weight of processing, because hooks are made in hundreds of thousands at a time, and the weight of just the mass would destroy the hook points. So there are limits to technology, and there is certainly, as I said, no slur on any company to say you take their hook and you hand sharpen it. So again, I think anyone who tries to make an argument or a point that a hook from a packet is better than a hook, or even as good as a hook that is hand sharpened, I think anyone trying to claim that is on very dodgy ground indeed, because if the end objective is to penetrate flesh, then surely sharper is better than as sharp, or even less sharp or blunter. So to my mind, you can't be too sharp as long as it's well honed, the point of the shape is balanced, and you haven't compromised the integrity of the strength of the hook in the area that really matters, which is what I'm going to come to. Now, just to clarify my rationale on it, there's no doubt that you can catch carp on blunt hooks. Why? Because we're blessed with fishing for a species that when it hooks itself, or when it pricks itself, when it realizes something's wrong, the majority of the time they'll bolt in panic, which gives us that fantastic run. And I think the whole industry's set up on that, really. The run, the bite, you know, the flashing lights, the noise. Because imagine if every bite was like a bream bite, like one beep or a drop back. I don't think this industry would even exist. So the fact that carp do bolt in panic is really their downfall, and it's to our massive advantage, because it means that even if a hook point is packet sharp, and a lot of them are very good from different companies these days, or even if it's less sharp, it could even be slightly damaged. I mean, I heard not long ago a story about some old boy on a club lake who caught 110 fish on one hook, and I just thought, well, they must be hungry in there, you know. But the point is that you can catch fish on blunt hooks like that, because when a carp is compelled to panic and it bolts, then the weight of the lead, the weight of all the line through the water, which weighs a lot of resistance, particularly if it's fluorocarbon, but even if it's just normal line, then it hits the rod tip, then the reel's going on a hopefully a tight clutch and bait runner. So before you even get to the rod, the hook should be pretty well seated, even if it wasn't amazingly sharp to begin with. So it is entirely possible, because carp are panicky creatures, to catch fish on less sharp hooks. So why sharpen them? We all know through looking at underwater films, from watching carp in stalking situations, when we're up close watching them, we all know that not all carp bolt. There are what I call sitters, and sitters are the carp that will realise something's wrong, and they will try to get rid of it on the spot as carefully as they can without panicking. Now, those fish are very, very hard to catch for obvious reasons, but they are catchable. But the important thing is that, to my mind, the percentage of what I call sitters and the percentage of bolters or panickers will change on any given day according to what's going on meteorologically around you. So say, for example, it's bang on conditions, the fish are jumping out, they're having a good feed, there's plenty of fish getting caught, the fish are very active. Then in that kind of situation, you might have maybe 80% of your stock will be a bolter, what I would call a bolter, that will, when it feels something wrong, it will tear off and it's game on. But 20% will still be a sitter. Conversely, when the weather changes and you maybe high pressure and it's hot, or maybe it's in the middle of winter and the fish aren't very active, they're not doing much, then the proportion of sitters will go right up, and you could have 80% of your fish could be sitters and 20% will be bolters when it's hard. But the point is that you will always have a good number of sitters at any one time that will try their level best to get rid of the hook. There's no doubt in my mind that having a surgically sharp hook point that is perfectly refined is a huge edge to catching not only the bolters, because you'll catch them anyway, as I just illustrated, but to catching those sitters, the ones that you otherwise might not have caught. Every year I'm fortunate enough to catch a small number of fish that are very, very rare visitors to the bank. In fact, even on this lake, thinking about it, there's one that I caught twice recently. Caught him in June, and then I caught him a couple of weeks ago, almost 50 pounds. And he's been caught by one other angler in 3 years. Now, that could be down to a lot of different things, but there's no doubt in my mind that on a lake that is as pressured as this syndicate with this many anglers, fish get very good at dealing with and avoiding rigs. And when I look back through my photographs, you know, from various lakes that I can think of, if there's a rare one or an odd one, quite often it will come my way. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons that happens is that the hook points are just too sharp for them to deal with. So the hook point goes in and then it carries on traveling. That's the key, which I'm going to show you when we do the sharpening in a minute. When it goes in and it keeps on traveling with very little resistance, you get to a stage where you cannot shake it out. So if you've got a hook that is just sharpened on the very end of the tip, which is probably how most people do it and how 1 or 2 different companies now do it, you've created a hook which is sticky sharp. That's great. I want a hook that is what I call penetrationally sharp, which is a totally different ball game, and that relies on the point being thinned out all the way from the tip of the point down to just before it starts to go around the bend. When a hook is thinned out to that degree, maybe you've got a size 4 hook and you've got the point diameter and thickness and structure of maybe a size 8 hook on the end, and that will go in so far, so deep, so quickly that it will cause a lot of problems for a cagey fish. So I'm going to show you how I go about my sharpening, and all of my hooks are beak pointed, so I haven't got any straight points to do it on, but I find beak points actually sharpen a lot easier and better anyway than straight points. So I'll show you what I do in a moment, and we'll look at what I consider to be one of my biggest carp fishing edges, hook sharpening. Okay, you join me in a new pitch, because even though I'm supposed to be working and doing this video for you guys on rigs and hook sharpening and stuff, the swim was empty of carp, and that will simply never do. So we put the work on ice for a couple of hours. I found the fish in a different part of the lake, and we packed up and moved on to them. And I'll be talking a little bit more softly for this. You'll still be able to hear me, but one of the rods is in fairly close to the bank, so I'm just going to keep everything low key. It's how I like to deliver anyway. I'm not one of those shouty presenters. There's too many of them. So let me see. Hook sharpening. So we've covered the background, the philosophy of it, and why I think it's important to do it, and the difference that it can make for you in terms of the sitters and the bolters. And the process of doing it is fairly intricate, as you can probably imagine. So I'm going to go through that step by step on a very, very high quality beak pointed hook, as I favour, and we'll show you just how sharp you can get something like this. So this is a size 5 Thinking Angler's curve point, or beaked point as I tend to call it, and we'll get one of those out. Now, as with most good quality manufacturers on the market today, these hooks are sticky sharp, straight from the packet, really sharp. However, the same as with most other hooks on the market that are good, with light pressure the point will only go in a couple of mil. After that it hits a shoulder of metal, and it won't go any further unless you pull it really hard. Now, if I pricked myself and I was a wary carp, a sitter that we talked about earlier, I've only got to shake my hand a couple of times and that is out, no question. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to lose the hook, but you know, it's hanging on there now, but it would be out. What we want is a hook hold that goes down past the point, down to the barb as quickly and as smoothly as possible, and most importantly with as little resistance as possible, because that means the easier it goes in, the sharper it is. You know, if it needs a lot of weight to pull it in, then it's probably not that sharp in the first place. Most of the leads that I use are in the 2 to 2.5 ounce bracket. I very rarely use anything heavier than that. That's more than enough to cause a carp a lot of problems with a super sharp hook. Now, when you're looking at sharpening hooks, there's only one system that I've ever used, and that is the Jag Kit. I'm not affiliated to Jag in any way, but I've used their kit since it came on the market in about 2010, probably, something like that. Is that 10 years? Wow. So yeah, before that I used to get Jason Hayward to hand sharpen hooks for me, and then eventually I graduated onto doing it myself. And just to give you a quick bit of background, I mean, the obsession with hook sharpness has always been right at the forefront of my small brain, even to the point that back in, I can remember in about 1997 getting the size 4 continental boilie hooks from the warehouse when I was working at Drennan and we were starting off the ESP brand. Terry was fishing the stiff hinge, and the first stiff hinges that he used over those formative years always incorporated a size 4 continental boilie hook, because at that point we hadn't designed the stiff rigger, which was obviously a dedicated hook for that job, but the continental was very, very good for its purpose, for that purpose, and is still the hook that I tend to favour to this day. Back then I used to get a load of them out of the warehouse, boxes of 1,000, and I used to take them back up to the office, and on my lunch break I would grade through them using a high-powered microscope. I made a little jig, little template, so I could just take the hook, drop it in, and everything was zoomed in, so I didn't have to mess about. It was all pre-focused, so if I dropped the hook in the right place, look through there, and I could process the hooks very, very quickly. So the sharpest ones with the most perfectly formed points, I used to send 2/3 of them to Terry because he was fishing all the time, and I would keep some for myself for my fishing at weekends. We never believed that you could take a hook that was made by the leading Japanese hook manufacturers, the leading ones in the world, and still the best ones today are in Japan. We didn't believe that you could take one of their hooks and sharpen it. In fact, it never even entered our minds, in all honesty. It was just, to our mind, it would be making a pig's ear out of something that was perfect. And it was only really when Jason Hayward opened everyone's eyes to what could be achieved with a jeweler's file that revolution in carp fishing technology began. But back then, sharpening was definitely a swear word. You know, you didn't put a stone on them or anything. They had to be perfect to begin with. So that obsession for me, so yeah, I mean, even back to the microscope days, that's 23, 24 years. And before that, we just used to do the finger test. So it's always been there, that appreciation that sharper is always better. Now, as I mentioned, I'm using the Jag Kit. There are only, well, I say only, there are 3 items that you need in order to sharpen a hook properly. You must have a vise. You cannot do it without a vise. People who say they can sharpen hooks holding it in their fingers, they're not doing a good job, or you can do a better job with this. You need the black handled file, which is the coarse heavy duty file, and you need one of the red or green stones. Not essential, but nice for polishing up. These are the only tools you really need to sharpen the hook, along with the ever essential, vitally important eyeglass. And you can see all of this. It's about as worn as the soles of my boots. Proper, well used. As important to me as the 3rd rod or the set of Polaroids, or, you know, this is frontline kit for me. So let's look at how we use it. Okay, so I'm left-handed, and I take the hook and pop it into the slot furthest away from the thumb wheel. If you're right-handed, you want to have the wheel facing towards you, and you're going to place the hook into the slot furthest away from the thumb wheel, and then you're going to lock it up tight at 45 degrees with the eye and the point facing to the sky. So that's how you would have it for a right-handed person. As you would look at it, the wheel be facing you, and the hook is in the slot furthest from the, got a helicopter coming over, another army helicopter, is in the slot furthest away from the wheel, okay? That's how you set it for someone who's holding the file in their right hand. I'm a bit cack-handed, so for a left-handed person you want it like that, wheel facing you, hook on this side, point and eye towards the sky, 45 degrees. Once you've got it in there, lock it in place. The vices with the slot in the thumb wheel are my preference for that reason. Be very careful if you use the file, because you can snap them. I've never done it because I'm careful, but lock it up as tight as you can. Now, the next most important thing to mention is that the vice stays static throughout the entire operation. I put it on my right thigh and I hold it down, and with the file in my left hand, I work along the hook point. You want to hold the file like this, with the handle in the palm of your hand, and your forefinger bracing the file as so. And what you're going to do is you're going to work along the point of the hook from the bend to the point. The most important thing is where you start filing. Now, when you look at the hook point, you can see that even on this very, very well made hook, after 2 or 3 mil, you've got a constant diameter, and that is a common theme for all hooks on the market. They ultimately have a very, very fast taper where it goes from a thick diameter to a very thin diameter over a very short distance. And this is what causes hooks to stick but not go in any further. So sticky sharp, they'll prick you, they won't carry on going because the shoulder of metal behind the point is too thick, too broad. So the main element of our sharpening process is to take that shoulder away and thin that metal out so the whole thing slides in really, really easily. Now the area that you need to start filing is opposite the barb. You never, ever, ever want to take metal off here. This is the elbow or the bend of the hook. This is where you need the strength. Never remove metal there. And we don't want it on the tip because we're going to do the tip later on. We want the file simply flat on top opposite the barb. So we're going to take it, lock it against our thigh, and with a nice smooth stroke, using the entire length of the file, apply as much pressure as you're comfortable with, and you're going to start working that metal. Make sure the swarf is coming out of the file so it's not getting clogged up. And what I'm aiming to achieve is to get the upright point section of the hook down in diameter by about 30%. So we're getting it to 2/3 of what it started at. Okay, so we've now done the job there. We've taken that down by at least 1/3. We've not touched the bend at all, and we've not touched the point yet. If you look at that, you'll be able to see that the Teflon is still in place on the tip, and you can also see the bottom end of the sharpened area or the filed area like so. So that shows you exactly where the hit point is. Now that we've got that down in diameter, we need to blend this flattened area into the tip of the point. Because right now the tip of the point is almost like a chisel shape, it steps down, and what we want to do is blend it so it's a nice smooth radius from the point that it begins all the way to the end of the hook. To do that, place it back onto our thigh, press it down, hold it in position, and we follow the file, follow the shape of the hook, with the file, starting slightly higher up, just above the barb, and then gently roll with the shape of the hook towards the point. Don't be gung-ho. This file takes a lot of metal off, and after 2 or 3 strokes, always stop and check and make sure that you're not overdoing it. And this is where the eyeglass is absolutely imperative. Doesn't matter how good your eyes are, you will not be able to see exactly what you're achieving without one of these. Okay. Focal length is very close, probably only 30 mil or so. Always do it against something light in colour, whether it's a bit of white water in front of you or the white sky or a pint of milk if you're in your bivvy. Anything that gives a nice light coloured background so you can see exactly what's going on. Now, what are we looking for? If you imagine I've got a sheet of paper, and on that bit of paper I've drawn a hook point, and on the end of that drawing of the hook point I've got the pen and I've done a line. Now if you look through the eyeglass and you see that shape of a point and then a line on the end, you've over sharpened the tip of the hook. That piece of metal will fold over. You can make the point very thin and very fine, but you need to be able to see both sides of the metal all the way to the end. That's why the eyeglass is so important. We're very nearly there. Okay, so we've now got a very, very slow taper. is what we want. Not a fast taper, but that big shoulder of metal is no good to us because the hook will jam. We want it long, slender and thin like this, and then it will just carry on going in. The hook point that I've created on this runs all the way from the very tip of the hook down to, I mean, these hooks have got a nice low barb placement. I would say that the finished area is probably just below the barb. There's no danger at all of lost strength or anything there. You can make the point very, very thin. You'll have to change it after you've caught a fish, but by then it's done its job. As far as I'm concerned, same with losing a lead with a fish. You know, I buy my leads as well. It's, to me, get the tool as good as you can get it, let it do its job, and then change it. Every now and again you'll get one that seems to be okay, and if it is with the eyeglass and it feels sharp to your finger, then by all means cast it back out. 9 times out of 10 it'll be buckled. It will go in and it will buckle over. And just brings to mind actually that I had someone mention to me the other day that hook sharpening was banned on his syndicate because one of the old bailiffs in his wisdom has decided to ban it because he said it was bad for the fish because the end of the hook, the tip of the hook, always snapped off and left a splinter in the fish's mouth. I have never ever seen that, and I've been making my hook points ridiculously thin for getting on for 10 years now, and it doesn't happen. It will buckle over where it hits a hard part of the mouth. Doesn't matter, it's done its job by then. But I've never had one snap off, so if anyone tells you that, tell them they're talking utter bull. So we've got this where we want it. If I look through the eyeglass onto the front of the hook, I can see that because this is quite a coarse file, there are some sort of groove lines or plough lines that it's left, and that's where the other guy comes into play. One of the little polishing stones, you see that's had a fair bit of use, not much left on that, and I use this just to polish out the grooves. Again, it's gilding the lily almost, really. You're polishing it off, but you're taking out those groove lines, and something that is totally smooth is going to penetrate fractionally more than something that has got score marks all down it, because that is going to grip. So again, it's a very, very small thing, the polishing, but it is adding to what you're trying to create. Over and above that, I'm certain that having a polished surface prevents, or reduces, I should say, any ingression from water that's got a high pH or acidic quality to it, because over the course of time your hooks will start to corrode. The coatings that we're taking off are the ones that are put on there to prevent oxidization and corrosion. So by removing those, we're creating bare metal. If that bare metal is grooved or almost porous, then I think it's going to get attacked more readily. So I polish them out for that reason, and also just to give me an extra slicker penetration. That's what she said. So I'm just going to polish that off. That's beautiful. We can get a touch more on that. My stone is so used that I'm just trying to use the edge of it now. I've got about 2 mil to play with. Okay, just about there. So let's compare our hooks. So this is the finished hook. Now, if you're going to sharpen your hooks like this, it is imperative, it's vital that you look after them and you check them regularly. Sometimes I go out on a tutorial and I don't always show the hook sharpening, because I can see that from the way the person angles, it's just going to make their life harder. If you're the sort of person that has got that massive OCD and attention to detail and you don't miss a trick, this will work for you. Where it won't work for you is if you're the sort of person who's a little bit lackadaisical in your approach, maybe. You know, you've only got to nick this on the butt ring, for example. If you're putting your rig into, you've got to just nudge that against the ceramic, it's buckled over. You have to check the point every single cast without fail. because occasionally you will donk it over on a stone or something hard on the bottom, and if you don't notice that and you wind it in and you go for the recast and it's out there all night with a buckled over point, it's a million times worse than it started off when it came out of the packet. Probably won't catch you anything. So you've got to look after them, treat them like a newborn baby. Even if when you're wrapping your line out around the sticks, on that last wrap, don't lift the rig off the ground or swing it towards you or anything, could catch you on anything down there. The last wrap, walk forward, pick your rig up, take it away safe. Look after them. What we've created is a surgical instrument, really. It's a scalpel we've made from a battle axe. And the difference is quite clear. Now, sticky sharp. Now you can see that's gone in a couple of mil, and I'm pulling that hard, pushing it hard. It's not going in anymore because it's too chunky behind the tip. I'll shake that and it's gone. And if we take the hook that we've just sharpened, well, I've not even put as much pressure on that, and you can see that's almost down to the barb. Not even past the barb, but it's probably 4 mil in. And look, can't even shake that out. That is the difference between landing a sitter or a bolter, because when you get a sitter that does that and it's in suddenly 4 mil down to the barb and they can't get rid of it, they'll try for a little while. And I've seen fish do this. Had those little bleeps on the indicators as well where you can't see, and I've watched them on really pressured day tickets, and you'll get little indications, and then sometimes I've left them, and sometimes after as long as a minute it will just pull up tight and go because the fish has just given up trying to get rid of it. Get used to using the top layer of your skin. That part of the epidermis has got no nerves or blood flow. You can put the hook point straight through it, which is imperative if you're going to learn how sharp your hook should feel, because when you're casting to a spot and you're doing a recast, obviously if you can, don't let the rig touch the bottom. I had to do a few casts earlier on to get one of the rods in place, and if it hasn't landed exactly how I want it on the skyline, I'll just bring it in before it's touched the bottom. If it has touched the bottom and it's not the drop that I'm after, get it up off the bottom and away from danger. Don't drag it lazily along the bottom. So just be sensible, you know, it's common sense. But what you're going to do is, when you've done that cast, you're going to bring the rig in, you're going to swing it to hand, and you will know instantly by placing the tip of your finger or thumb on that hook whether or not it's got damaged. And it's important to get to know what that feels like, because you can't be doing, every time you've done a recast, going back in your bivvy, getting the eyeglass. It's too time consuming. You just want to be able to do it by touch. So just get used to sliding those through the tip of your finger and getting to know what a really sharp hook feels like. The last thing I'll do, I give it a little lick of Vaseline, just to try and seal that bit of bare metal off, because as I said, we've removed the coating that's designed to make it corrosion proof. The Vaseline will slow down the oxidization process, but it won't prevent it entirely. You will find that different types of lake bed are more aggressive on your hook points than others. Generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, the really clear sandy and gravel spots are quite kind to your hook points, and by that I mean when you do wind them in, they'll still be nice and shiny, and they'll be untarnished. Usually it's the siltier spots that will tarnish your hook points and make them go black, sometimes after just a few hours. And if it's really bad silt, like the place I fished last year, some of the bottom there will actually seem to eat the hook points, and we had to back off the sharpening because overnight some of the metal will get eaten away. Very, very rare to come across that. So I would say don't worry about it. Put a lick of Vaseline on. When you wind in your rig in the morning or at the end of the day, if your hook point is tarnished, then look at it with the eyeglass. If it's still got its structural integrity and it's sharp, then there's no need to change it. Take your stone, take the tarnish off carefully, another lick of Vaseline, and you're back in action. There's no need to throw it away. So that is hook sharpening 101 on a beak pointed hook, which is the only sort of hook that I use, and I believe that it is a massive edge in my carp fishing, so much so that actually I'm going to ask the cameraman to delete all this. We can't go public with this, can we? So that is our hook sharpening 101 completed. Do it carefully, do it properly, add it into your armoury, practice at home. Before you know it, you'll be knocking out 30 hooks while she's watching EastEnders, and it'll become second nature to you. Now we just moved swims, and although this isn't a session video, I am giving you a little insight into the gear that I've been using. So we looked at my first go-to rod setup earlier on with the RIGS air curve rod, the rival reel, and the Berkeley monofilament with a fluorocarbon leader and a tubing and leg clip setup, which is, as I said, my standard sort of go-to, which I can get onto any day ticket water in the country pretty much with that. It doesn't cause any problems with rules. Here at my Northamptonshire syndicate, we've got a bit more flexibility, and my setup is slightly different. Now I'm using a prototype sinking braided reel line. I do like a braided reel line. I've used it a lot over the years. A sinking braid is, or a braid I should say, of any type is essential if you're dealing with fish in thick weed, if allowed. It's, yeah, if there's a lot of weed and big fish about, then there's nothing better for landing them than braid. Most of my fishing is for good sized fish on lakes that tend to be very weedy. So if I can use braid, I always will. Here, there isn't any weed, but there is a lot of abrasive mediums on the shelf in terms of small little mussels, zebra mussels, pea mussels, and stuff like that. So the bottom is quite abrasive in places, and I like to fish a very, very slack line. These fish are very big, they're very pressured. Once I've set my trap, I like everything to lay on the bottom, completely slack, unobtrusive, out of the way completely. Now, usually I would do that with fluorocarbon if there wasn't any weed and I was fishing in close, but historically people have been cut off on the take on this lake. You've got a very, very dense, heavy main line that's settled over sharp flints and pea mussels and so on. It pulls tight on the take and it can cause problems. And I've seen people with chafed up lines after they've hooked a fish. One of my mates even had a load of pea mussels and that clamped onto his line while he was playing at a mid-40, so not ideal. With braid, it's a lot less susceptible to that kind of damage. It sinks okay, but it doesn't sink with the same rate of something like fluorocarbon. So it's low, it's on the bottom, but it's very light, you know, it's very tactile. So it hasn't caused me any problems at all. It's given me that extra durability because it's slack. If it pulls across anything sharp, I mean, you try and cut braid with scissors, you need to hold the braid tight to cut through it, don't you? But when it's slack, it's very, very hard to cut through. It's very tough, whereas even with slack mono, you can snip through it in a heartbeat. So that's my kind of rationale. The braid's been working very well. One or two instances I've had where it's just been furred up a little bit, where it's run over a flint or a mussel, but I just strip it back and change it like I do with line. So yeah, sinking braid on a Pen Affinity 2 and twin with the 3.5 Accelerate rod. Again, as I said, fish very, very slack. On the business end of the line, I have a leg core leader. Very, very simple setup. There's my favoured Roger and Kerry lead 2.5 ounce, and that is simply fished on the end of my braid, and usually with a little bit of dot of putty on the needle knot where I've joined it to the main line, and that is fished slack and supple over the bottom. Leg core choice, very important. All of my terminal gear, or virtually all of it, is from Thinking Anglers, and by far and away the best leg core on the market is this one. It's got a beautiful fluctuation in colour to it, so it breaks up that outline that I talked about earlier, does that itself. It's very, very strong, easy to splice, but it's also very, very supple, which means that it really will sink and settle over anything on the bottom, any undulations and so on. It's very strong, durable, does everything that I need. So that's the setup that I'm using. The last thing that I've got to show you is, of course, the RIGS. And it's getting dark now, so we're going to go over those in the morning. In the meantime, I'm going to try my hardest to catch a carp, although as I said, this isn't a session video, but obviously we're filming on the bank, so I'm trying to catch a carp. It's autumn now, it's the beginning of September, it's cool, there's still a few mozzies about, but I've moved, I've got on fish. Hopefully I'll have something we can show in the video, but regardless of that, in the morning we'll go through my top 2 or 3 rigs and talk about them, when I use them, situations I use them in, and how you can incorporate them into your angling. See you tomorrow. Okay, another swim. It's been a busy old trip. Anyway, we're going to look at the rigs that I tend to favour now, and you see how sharp that hook is, just swinging in the fresh air and it nicks hold of me. So rigs are obviously a cornerstone of fascination for all carp anglers, myself included, but we needn't get too bogged down in the variety of rigs. Most rigs, if they're in the right place, untangled, with a bait the fish are willing to eat, will work. So if you think of a fish that you've caught on, let's say a KD rig or something on a particular day, I would be willing to bet that if you had had a blowback rig, a bottom bait rig with curved tubing, a knotless knot with a little kicker, whatever, in the same spot that wasn't tangled, with a sharp hook and a good bait at the same time, you would have caught on that rig as well, and that rig or that rig or that rig. So the key is putting it in the right spot, in a bit of bottom that's clean enough so the rig can be picked up, and I do that by leading around with a bare lead. Anywhere that slides smoothly with no resistance I'll fish, and it obviously must be untangled and presented on the bottom. And although everyone has their favourite rigs, and I have my favourite rigs, I'm long in the tooth enough to admit that probably, if I think of captures that I've had even recently, another good quality rig in the same spot probably would have done just as good a job. So whilst it's important to not be afraid to experiment, I think also don't get bogged down in all these different kinds of rigs. I mean, people quite often, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what's a good rig for a wafter? What's a wafter rig? I haven't got any idea what a wafter rig is. I just make a rig, like a bottom bait rig, which I'll show you in a minute, and I put a wafter on it. I don't think you have to have a standard designation type of rig for a wafter or for any other type of hook bait, come to that matter. It just makes things confusing. So we'll come back to more of that in a minute. I'm fishing a leg core leader on my syndicate to deal with all the flints and mussels and pea mussels, zebra mussels that are all over the edge. Gives me that robust end tackle that I need. The lead is attached using a C-clip, which means it will come off should it hit weed or snags or anything like that, if it needs to come off, otherwise it will stay in place. Anyway, that's the leader. We're looking at rigs. Now, this little devil is what I call a stiff multi-hinge. All of my rigs incorporate a stiff loop by the hook section. Two key reasons for that. One, I'm really fastidious about hook sharpening, and having that loop allows me to change the hook in a heartbeat if I need to. Secondly, there's no doubt in my mind that the most successful rigs that I've used over the last couple of decades have incorporated something stiff by the hook itself. A stiff extension to the hook makes it very difficult for a carp to deal with. It also, I think, has a bit of a fright mechanism insofar as it makes the fish go like that and then they bolt, and that's what you want them to do, rather than sitting there trying to get rid of the rig. So this is the stiff multi-hinge. Now, this is a rig that I've been using for a few seasons now, probably about 3 or 4 years, and I like it because in an age that is populated by Ronnie rigs ad nauseum, this creates something fairly similar, but with even more movement and with a lot less metal and clutter. I was using it a bit before the Ronnie rig came out, and I continue to use it, and you might be surprised to know that I've never ever tied a Ronnie rig, let alone cast one out. So you don't need to be a slave to fashion. So this rig, as you can see, it uses a very stiff fluorocarbon boom. That's about 60-pound fluorocarbon to make a stiff boom. And the secret is that the hook is attached to a 10mm section of braid. Now, or the hook loop I should say, is attached to a 10mm section of braid. Now I tie that using a double Albright knot. It's very fiddly and tricky to tie and takes a lot of practice, but fear not, once you've tied it, you don't need to tie it again because you've got a loop to change your hook. In fact, the 3 rigs that I've got here, including this one I'm showing you now, have been on my rods or in my tackle box for the last 3 years. They're absolutely fine. They're made of such rigid, strong, tough components that they don't get damaged. I change the hook when I need to, and they might take 20 minutes to tie each one, but then you never have to tie another one unless you lose a rig. So the beauty of this, I think, is how we have incorporated a load of movement into an otherwise totally rigid hook link. The hook section itself, super stiff because it's got a doubled section of recoil stiff mono there, and the boom section, which is super stiff fluorocarbon. As you can see, the hook is like a whirligig. Not even a Ronnie Rig moves like that, because nothing has got as much fluidity as soft, supple braid. And that's why I think this rig is so effective. Whichever angle the carp comes from, it's going to take a good hold and get a good grip. So that's the rig that I've been using mostly for the last few years. As I said, I put that onto a helicopter, well, it is set up on a leg-core helicopter style leader. I set the top bead just above, a couple of inches above like that. Now, one question that just come to my mind that I also get asked a lot is about silt fishing. If you're going to be fishing in any kind of silt, there is no rig better than a helicopter rig, a helicopter lead setup I should say. Let's keep the two things separate. The rig is that bit with a hook attached to it, and the lead setup is the leader itself. Now, I don't tend to worry too much about silt. I think if you're trapping the lead before it hits the water, you're feeling it down properly, then unless it is very shallow and very silty, you shouldn't be getting too much plug in. As I said, I fish a lot of different places and I can't remember the last time I had a lot of plug. Sometimes, you know, when the tip will bend a bit and then it'll unplug and slide, you know, that's just silt where your lead's gone in a couple of inches. So I just move the bead up maybe 4 inches or so. If it was any thicker than that, or if I was really worried, you know, I'd happily move it up a foot or two and couple that with a slow sinking balanced hook bait. That's how to deal with silt. Use the lightest lead that you can as well. So that is my sort of go-to rig. Now, because it has got such a super stiff boom section, it fishes best over a very hard, clean bottom. Now, if I want to fish it over any kind of silkweed, silt, leaf litter, anything that is still cleanish, but is perhaps not as rock hard as pea shingle gravel, then the rig stays the same, but I use cam skin, which is Thinking Angler's coated braid, to make the boom, and I Albright knot that to the loop, the multi-rig that goes over the hook. It's a big shout out to 𝗵𝗲𝗿𝗄 actually for coming up with the multi-rig. It's been a go-to really for a lot of anglers now, and Mike was the first person to publicise that. So cheers for that, Mike. All of my rigs have incorporated a multi-rig in one form or another for the last number of years, a lot of years. So the thinking behind this is that if your bottom is slightly cruddy or undulating, or even if it's just smooth silt, anything that isn't rock hard, then I'll fish this softer, more yielding boom. It's just got a bit more fluidity to it, and it's stiff enough to push the hook bait away from the lead, and you've still got that hook section there nice and stiff, which is hard for the fish to deal with. Now, the beauty of this rig, and really these two rigs are the same, they create the same effect. They've got a loop by the hook. One's got a super stiff boom for fishing on which I think is probably the hardest for the fish to deal with, because as soon as it picks that up, whichever way it goes, you've got a very, very stiff double jointed section, and there's nothing really that behaves like that. I've never seen a rig that behaves quite like that one does. The beauty of this is that not only can you interchange the hook, but you can fish a bottom bait or a wafter or a pop-up. Although quite often for my boilie fishing, I have in the past been fishing just a krill pop-up. in the last year or so, it's all been about bottom baits because everybody's fishing pop-up. So a bottom bait straight out the bag, same as what I'm feeding, or a toughened hook bait if I'm using krill, because krill's quite soft, and that goes straight on the hair. And nobody fishes like that anymore. You know, bottom baits are very, very potent at the moment. My advice would be to ditch the Ronnies, ditch the bright ones, match the hatch using either a low set matching pop-up, or a bait straight out the bag would be even better if the bottom's clean. So really, they are my rigs. The multi-loop by the hook, and then either a supple boom if I'm fishing over anything other than rock hard bottom, and then if it's rock hard clean bottom, a really nice stiff fluorocarbon boom. And that's it really. You know, as I said, you can fish pop-ups, bottom baits, wafters, you could fish tiger nuts, you could fish whatever you wanted on them, and you could use them over any type of lake bed. You could use this version with a lead clip, and I have used it successfully with a lead clip a lot. I wouldn't fancy this one with a lead clip because the boom could go in with the clip and stand up stiff if you're on a soft bit of bottom. But yeah, if I was fishing a lead clip, then the coated section for the boom, and then the hook section like that. Generally I try and keep the pop-ups low so they're inconspicuous if I am fishing a pop-up. But again, just to reiterate, it's all about bottom baits at the moment. Not a lot of people will tell you that, but fashion has been the cause of a bit of a downturn in people's results. I think everyone's fishing the same way. Don't be afraid to break the mold. Think about your angling and think about what you're doing. So they're my standard two go-to rigs that you can use with anything. And that pretty much wraps up what we've been looking at in terms of rigs. We've covered hook sharpness. Again, the style of sharpening that I showed you will allow you to create a sharper point, certainly than a packet hook, and even sharper than some of the ones that are provided by companies. And it will be a better shape point because the ones that I've seen that are made by companies are only sharpened on the end, whereas the style that I showed you will thin out that whole section and make it much more effective than a hook that is just sharp on the tip. Remember, it's not about sticky sharpness, it's about penetrational sharpness, which is how far it goes in, how quick it goes in compared to the amount of pressure we're putting on it. So we looked at hook sharpness, we've looked at rod and reel setups, leaders, lines, and we finished off looking at the two rigs. What I will do just before I go is show you how I construct the double Albright so that you can practice that, and then you can crack on and have a go at it. So to start off, get yourself a section of stiff rig material and fold it into a loop, because this is going to be the multi-rig part, and then at the other end where you've got the two cut-offs, fold it back on itself to create an eye. And then all we're going to do is, using some thick 25-pound braid, we're going to tie an Albright knot to that eye that we've created. So we go up 8 times, and then back 4 times, and then go down through the hole like so. If you're not sure about an Albright, there's lots of stuff on the internet. I'm just going to tighten that up to my mouth. And make sure that that is, of course, properly tightened down. All knots should always be completely bedded down. Let's trim off those tag ends and the braid. And there you have it. So this is the multi section that will attach to our hook. Now if we were using the rig attached to coated braid like the version that I showed you earlier, then I simply tie it with the uncoated stripped off section of the coated braid. I usually cover that with a bit of shrink tube to make it all nice and neat, and then have the putty just behind it so it's got lots and lots of movement. I'm going to show you how to make a double Albright out of this. So this will be our boom material. So we're going to fold it over like that to create an eye. Put it in my other hand. And bring the braid up through from underneath and pull it all the way through until it won't go any further, because the knot you've already tied is locked against your fingers, and then start tying your Albright, which is 8 turns up, and then 4 back down, and then down through the hole that you originally came up through. Very important. So it looks like that. Always wet your knot thoroughly, slide it down. Now I've done this in a bit of a rush, but you can see that you can get it very, very short indeed. Now I can get it 2 or 3 mil shorter than that if I need to. I do like it as short as possible, so that when I put my putty on the Albright that's on the boom section, on the end of the boom, once the putty is over, I've only got 2 or 3 mil of bare braid before I get to the loop. Sheathe this in, or cover this in putty, and sheathe this bit on the hook loop in a bit of shrink tube. You can see it's got a bit of a twist there where I've tied it, so I'll make sure that that comes out. Always make sure your rig is as neat and tidy as you can possibly get it. But that is the Double Albright. So that just about wraps up our look at rigs. Probably less complicated than you thought it was going to be till you try and tie the Double Albright, that is. But with practice it's easily done, and as I said, you only need to do it the once and the rig's done unless you lose it. So the common theme with my rigs is, as you probably would have noticed, is that they incorporate some degree of stiffness to them. Even the softer version that I use still uses a fairly semi-stiff coated braid. Now, although stiff rigs are good for dealing with carp and or dealing with riggy carp, they play a vital role, in my opinion, in preventing tangles, which is the #1 enemy of all carp anglers, is tangles. So I would suggest or recommend always having a stiff boom section or a semi-stiff boom section, so that you are going to keep the rig away from the lead during flight and minimize those tangles as much as possible. Casting technique plays a huge role in that. You need to stop the lead either manually or via the clip before it hits the water, usually a couple of foot above the surface. Feather it, stop it, then it should hit the water, and then sink it on a tight line, keeping your rod up until it hits the bottom. If you do that and you use a rig tied with stiff or semi-stiff components, then you shouldn't ever have a tangle. Getting a rig on the spot is paramount, obviously. I'm looking for anywhere where I've seen fish activity. I will then lead around the area using a small little bomb on braid and my spod rod, usually like 1.5 ounce, 2 ounce lead. And I'm looking for any bit of bottom where the lead just slides smoothly without any resistance. If I find something rock hard and clean and it's quite small, then that's great. But if it is just smooth, clean silt, that's perfectly good to get a bite from. I'll clip it up. I clip my fishing rods and my spawn rod exactly the same. And maybe if I was fishing 20 foot or 25 foot of water, then I might have to start changing things. But quite often I wind in bits of my own bait when I'm bringing my rigs in on my really sharp hooks. So that proves that my freebies are around the rig as I want them. The point is that you have to keep doing the cast until you get the rig where you want it. We've just moved swims and I've been in a bit of a 𝗵𝗲𝗿𝗲 trying to get everything sorted out, and I was rushing a bit, and one of the rigs I just couldn't get on the money, and it probably took me 15 casts to get one rod how I wanted it. But you have to do that. You have to have that mindset. Near enough is never good enough, and it will cost you. Now the rigs are done, they're out there, I know they're perfect, I know they're untangled, I know they're presented on super clean pin sharp bit of bottom, and I baited them accurately as well. So I know they can stay there until I pack up tomorrow morning. I haven't got to worry about anything. There's no niggles in the back of my mind that, oh, should I have done that a bit better? Because you only put the rod on that bite alarm when everything is perfect. And that means your hook bait is perfect, your hook point is perfectly sharpened, your rig is in perfect order, it's cast perfectly, it's stopped before it hits the surface. The three events of a cast are separate. The dink where it hits the clip, the splash where it hits the water, the donk where it hits the bottom, all separate events. And if you've achieved all of those and you've got yourself in an area where there are carp and you're using a bait they're willing to eat, then you will catch carp. And if you've not fished, if you think about it, it's quite a simplistic format. But if you always execute those strategic cornerstones every time you go fishing, you will catch more fish. So it's pretty basic what I do. We've covered this before in watercraft. You've got to be in the right spot. And although I haven't been in the right spot, ultimately this trip, because I haven't had a bite, it's not really a session video, so it doesn't matter, but I've got on fish twice and they've moved off, and that sometimes happens, you know. Fish are flighty, they've been in a strange mood up here lately, but you've just got to keep doing it. Never give up, don't go stale, keep fighting, keep watching, keep looking, keep casting if you need to until it's perfect. Make sure everything is as good as you can possibly do it. Next time we're going to have a look at bait. We'll also talk about hook baits, which is a massively important part of the whole baiting conundrum. And we'll look at what I use different times of the year, I should say, and talk about different types of baiting pattern and when to bait up and everything else that goes with it. So if you've enjoyed this, please shout out to your mates, get them to have a watch, and we look forward to seeing you next time when we'll be talking about bait in our final chapter. Thanks for joining us.